Remember the Legacy of Kain games back when vampires were still kinda cool, I guess? The last real entry into the series was way back in 2003 with Legacy of Kain Defiance, and the multiplayer game Nosgoth shut down its servers in May of 2016. What happened to the series? Where did it go? Today on gameranx, we're going to take a look at what killed Legacy of Kain. The Legacy of Kain series began on November 1st, 1996 with the release of Blood Omen that was developed by Silicon Knights and published by Crystal Dynamics. Blood Omen tells the story of Kain, a nobleman who was murdered and ambushed by bandits and was offered the chance of revenge at the cost of becoming a vampire. And by the end of the game, it builds Kain up to be this big bad dickhead vampire that he is in all the games after this. At the time of release, Blood Omen was actually kind of different because it was more of a mature game that was intended for a more adult audience. Blood Omen was dark and almost gothic-like, and it also wasn't an easy game by any means. It definitely was something made for grown-ups. It had you asking what is evil, it had you questioning your morals, because you are a vampire, so you're technically kind of a bad guy. I mean, you eat people or whatever, there's, really nothing good about that. And even without the vampire thing going on, Kain himself is very self-centered and not very likable. I wouldn't even say he operated in a gray area, he's just straight up only in it for himself. I mean, the game's canonical ending has him fully embracing his vampirism and damning the whole land of Nosgoth to save himself, even after being offered the choice to sacrifice himself to restore the balance of the pillars of Nosgoth, which are these mythological structures that actually keeps all of Nosgoth balanced. And you had just spent the entire game murdering their guardians only to discover that you are the last guardian and that you staying alive actually throws off the balance. So yeah, he isn't a good dude by any means, which remains ongoing in the next games. When Blood Omen released, it got pretty good reviews, with most reviews praising the storytelling, so it's no surprise that Silicon Knights started working on a sequel. They started throwing around the idea of creating a new game in the series, but in '97 their partnership with Crystal Dynamics, who published Blood Omen, came to an end. It was around this time that Crystal Dynamics began work on Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. And during production, Crystal Dynamics was bought up by Eidos Interactive, and in '98 Silicon Knights filed a lawsuit against Crystal Dynamics in an attempt to get the rights to the Legacy of Kain IP back, also requesting an injunction which would prevent any marketing for Soul Reaver. But ultimately, Crystal Dynamics retained the rights to the IP, and eventually, after a few delays, released Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. But before it was called Soul Reaver, it was originally being developed as a game called Shifter, which featured a character that looks very much like Raziel, who you end up playing as in Soul Reaver. Actually, Shifter was one of 10 games that had something to do with Legacy of Kain that got cancelled. 10. That is an insane number. Now, technically, Shifter wasn't cancelled, but instead became something else. Another one of those games was the original idea for Soul Reaver 2, which was supposed to launch on PS1 after they made the decision to bring it to PS2. And another was a Blood Omen port for a Sega console, and the other 7 were like actual games that were going to take place in the Legacy of Kain universe, and they were all scrapped. The majority actually never made it out of the concept stage, but still, 10 games, that's insane. There was also a ton of cuts that were made to Soul Reaver, to the point where the final retail version that we got was almost an entirely different game than what Crystal Dynamics first had in mind. According to a Crystal Dynamics lead, there were about 2/3 of the game that was actually cut, including NPCs, locations, bosses, abilities, and even a good chunk of the story was cut as well. Looking back on it though, the writing is kind of on the walls. The first half of the game is much more open with stuff to explore, while the last half is very closed off and linear. And look how the game ends. It ends on a to be continued, and this crazy intricate story is just left riddled with loose ends and plot holes, and nothing's really finished. But we aren't here to talk about all of that, as interesting as it is. There's a few crazy long threads you can find online that breaks down all of these games, and I highly recommend you go check them out. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Soul Reaver immediately shows you how bad and self-centered Kain is. It takes place years and years and years after the events of Blood Omen, after Kain decided not to sacrifice himself, and he now rules his own tribe of vampires, which has caused the vampires to become the dominant species who have wiped out most of, if not all, human life. Kain has created lieutenants out of the corpses of vampire hunters and splits the lands up into tribes that they rule. Raziel, the playable character of Soul Reaver, is one of those lieutenants. And after undergoing a transformation that Kain has not and growing wings, Kain, out of jealousy pretty much, just rips off the wings and throws Raziel into the Lake of the Dead. And you awaken centuries later, destroyed and mangled, and is resurrected by the Elder God, and you become his Soul Reaver, and you set out to kill Kain and get your revenge. So now Kain is the big baddie that you're setting out to kill, and you know of Kain's powers and how evil he is because you spent all of Blood Omen helping him build up that power. While we aren't too sure on whether or not that was the plan all along, even though I'd assume no, because the OG idea for the sequel was for it to be a continuation of the Blood Omen series, and technically Soul Reaver is something else. Just based off what reviews say, one could say that that's why you'd play Legacy of Kain, was for the story, not for the sometimes repetitive gameplay. And the focus on the story continued throughout Soul Reaver 2, Defiance, and kind of in Blood Omen 2. The story there is just kind of meh, which makes sense because the usual crew of developers actually didn't work on that one, and its steampunk industrial setting really threw everyone off because previously every game took place in a very dark and gothic-like setting, so this just kind of changed it up and was kind of weird. The narrative here was kind of knocked on in most reviews, which is odd because the story was always the best part of any Legacy of Kain game. It's kind of like a video game epic when you think about it. Its story, while getting wacky here and there, is pretty well thought out and really good. Honestly, it comes off as a really good fantasy book turned video game, kind of like The Witcher. And a lot of this could very well have something to do with the fact that Amy Hennig was part of the team working on those games, which also may have something to do with how the next game was received. 2003's Legacy of Kain Defiance was the last true installment in the Legacy of Kain series, and this is the interesting installment for a few reasons. For one, both teams worked on it, the Soul Reaver team and the Blood Omen team, so it had a combination of elements from both games, and that's why it wasn't titled Soul Reaver 3 or Blood Omen 3, because here you're playing as both Kain and Raziel, so it didn't really fit into either of those series. It was kind of like its own new thing. During the development, Amy Hennig actually left Crystal Dynamics to go work for Naughty Dog to create some amazing games over there, and you can see the effect that it really had on Defiance. While the game did bring an end to the Kain and Raziel story, it didn't really bring everything full circle, and there were still some unanswered questions, and people noticed. So while the game didn't fail by any means, it was the first game in the series to just kind of be okay, and because of that, the series was put on hold with no plans to revive it. Although there was an interest in continuing the series, just not anytime soon. But in 2004, work was started on another entry called Legacy of Kain Dark Prophecy, which was being worked on by Ritual Entertainment, seeing that Crystal Dynamics had moved on to making Tomb Raider at that time. It was supposed to follow Kain as he traveled through different time periods, flip-flopping back and forth between young and elder Kain, but eventually the game was cancelled, and the same year work on the game actually started, which isn't a surprise, seeing that at this point, the series was starting to show its age a bit, and hadn't really changed it up too much. And nothing was done with the Legacy of Kain IP until about 2009-2010, after Square Enix had acquired Eidos Interactive. Around this time, Square Enix decided they wanted to try and bring the series back with a new game, and they had commissioned Climax Studios, who had worked on a few Silent Hill games, to develop this new one. This new game was codenamed Black Cloth, but would eventually go on to be called Legacy of Kain Dead Sun, and it was to be set in a distant time period, and was going to star a brand new character. It still took place in Nosgoth after Soul Reaver 2, and you technically played as two characters, kind of, but not really. The game starts off with Geen, who is a vampire, killing and feeding on a human named Asher. While feeding on him, something happens that fuses Asher's soul within Geen, giving Asher control of Geen's body, but Geen is still present within the body as well, and he would communicate with Asher, providing a different insight on what was happening in game. It was supposed to be a story-focused action-adventure open-world game with Batman Arkham-styled combat, and would also feature dungeon crawling and puzzles. It was heavily influenced by Soul Reaver, and it kind of comes off as a natural progression for that game. There was also a multiplayer mode being worked on as well, but that was being handled by Psyonix, which actually did see the light of day and was released as Nosgoth, which did end up getting cancelled, with its servers shutting down in 2016. Unfortunately, Dead Suns did end up getting cancelled a month before its big E3 reveal, and rumor has it that it was cancelled because Square Enix didn't think it was going to sell well enough to continue to dump money into marketing and the development costs. Its sales projections weren't great, and it didn't seem to be the Legacy of Kain game that people wanted, which isn't totally wrong because what players liked so much about the Legacy of Kain games was the characters, the story, the lore, and Dead Suns, while still taking place in Nosgoth, it was going to focus on a different character during a different time frame, and players maybe wouldn't have been too into that. Square Enix has said that there could one day be another Legacy of Kain game, but with the recent financial trouble they've run into, and them not willing to even hold on to Hitman, a game that was doing pretty well, I don't think a new Legacy of Kain game is happening anytime soon. So what killed the Legacy of Kain series? I think Legacy of Kain just worked better at a different point in time. That series is very much a PS1 and PS2 series, and I really don't know how it would hold up today. I mean, look at Nosgoth. Obviously not enough people cared enough to play it, and it was shut down. I love the Legacy of Kain games, and I know that I didn't care enough. Maybe the land of Nosgoth and all the vampires in it just kind of work better as a memory. It's a very old school game that maybe should remain that way. They were born in a time where early console games were very distinctly early console games. They had a certain feel and vibe that just doesn't come off the same way in 2018. Perhaps one day there's room for a reimagining or a rebirth. The newest Doom game revived the franchise in a new and fresh way, while also feeling distinctly badass and old school in a cheeky way. Maybe we'll get another look at Nosgoth one day. It doesn't seem like it anytime soon, but we can only hope. But we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments and let us know what you think. Have any of you even played a Legacy of Kain game? And what would you want to see in a new installment in the series? As I'm sure you already know, hitting the like button really helps us out, and if you're new here, subscribing is a great idea because we put up videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for watching, we really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.